Welcome to this channel. This isn't the kind of story that usually gets shared publicly, but it's one that carries an important lesson, especially for those of you with a stepson or those who are about to step into that role. Trust me, by the end of this video, there's a huge takeaway that you won't want to miss. If you've ever had moments in your family where things felt off, or when the words were hard to say, stick around. What happened next is something I think many can relate to, and there's a real lesson in it. I never imagined that a quiet afternoon, spent doing something as simple as cleaning, could turn into a moment that would forever change how I saw my family. My stepson, someone I had tried to understand, asked me something, just a single question, that left me utterly speechless. And no, it wasn't a question about homework or plans for the weekend. This one cut deeper. It all started like any other day. I was doing the usual, moving through the house, getting things in order. Mundane, familiar. I'd been in that house 1,000 times, hearing the same sounds, following the same routines. But that day, the air felt different. It's hard to explain, but there was this stillness, almost like everything was waiting for something. I didn't see it coming. One moment I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, lost in my own thoughts. The next moment, his voice broke through the quiet, pulling me into something I wasn't ready for. "Can I ask you something?" he said. His tone not unusual, but something about it made me stop. I didn't know it then, but this would be the moment that shook me to my core. His words seemed innocent at first, but there was something more beneath them, a weight that caught me off guard. I wish I could say I handled it with grace, but truth be told, I didn't. The request itself wasn't what I'd expected. In fact, it wasn't anything I could have predicted. And when he said it, something in me snapped. It was like a door I didn't even know was there had been kicked open, and what I saw on the other side, I wasn't ready for it. You might be wondering what happened next. What was the question? What could possibly be so unexpected? All I can say is, stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why this story isn't just about a moment. It's about a lesson that's bigger than anything I ever imagined. If you're someone who has or is about to have a stepson, or maybe you found yourself in a family dynamic that feels like it's missing something, keep listening. This story might change how you see things, just as it changed me. And if you're feeling this story, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to hear the rest. I had no clue what he was about to say when he asked if we could talk. But nothing could have prepared me for the words that followed. He sat across from me, his gaze focused on his hands. I could see he was struggling, trying to find the right words, and I knew, in that moment, he was about to share something that had been weighing on him for a long time. "I've never really told you this," he started, hesitating, "but I've always felt like you were just there, like you didn't really fit in with the family." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. At first, they didn't fully register, and I just stared at him, trying to process what I'd just heard. He wasn't angry, but there was something deep in his voice, something raw and vulnerable that cut through all the walls I hadn't realized we'd built. I thought back to all the moments I'd tried to connect with him, the hours spent helping with homework, the times I made his favorite meals, the sports games I showed up to, even when I knew I didn't fully belong. I thought we'd built something solid. But now, in the quiet weight of his words, I realized how much had been left unspoken, how much he'd been carrying, all on his own. It wasn't about me not trying. It wasn't about how hard I'd worked to bridge that gap. It was about something deeper, something I hadn't seen. I'd always been the other in his eyes, a figure who wasn't his mother, who couldn't ever fill those shoes, no matter how much I cared for him. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said, his voice faltering, his eyes on the floor. "I just needed you to know how I felt. I didn't want to keep it inside anymore." There was an undeniable truth in his words, a discomfort that neither of us could ignore. I didn't know how to respond at first. I wanted to reassure him, to fix it all, but I knew this wasn't something that could be easily fixed. This was the moment I realized it wasn't about me trying to play the part of his mother. It was about me accepting my role, however complicated it might be. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was just real, and for once, I didn't feel like I had to fill it with words. This was his truth. I was simply the person hearing it. And in that moment, it hit me that being a stepmom wasn't about molding myself to fit a certain expectation. It was about listening, about accepting that our relationship would take time, that it might look different than I'd imagined, but it was still worth fighting for. What happened next? That's a story for another time, but the takeaway from that moment? Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that bring us closer, even when we don't expect it. It's strange how, even in the quietest of moments, we sometimes fail to notice the things that are right in front of us. For months, something had felt off in the house. My partner, busy with work, wasn't home much. We'd fallen into a routine of small talk, but not much beyond that. There was a distance between us, one I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I thought maybe I was just overthinking it. After all, this was nothing new. Life had its seasons, and I assumed this was just another phase. But with my stepson, it was different. He was more withdrawn than usual. He'd been a lively, cheeky kid, the one who would crack a joke just to get under my skin, or shoot me a grin when I least expected it. Over the past few weeks, though, it was like he'd pulled away. The spark was gone, and his silence was something I couldn't ignore. I tried not to overanalyze it. After all, teenagers go through their phases, right? Maybe he was dealing with something I didn't understand. Maybe it was just the weight of growing up and it wasn't my place to intrude. But that day, it was different. I was doing my usual chores, tidying up the house. Everyone was out. It was just me and him. Normally, I would have welcomed the peace and quiet, but that afternoon felt different. The house was still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. I had a lot on my mind, work, life, everything, but I kept myself busy with small tasks like picking up stray socks and folding laundry. And then he appeared in the doorway. He wasn't rushing in with a story to tell or asking for something. He just stood there, his hands shoved in his pockets, his head shoved in his head bowed. It was unusual. He didn't look angry or frustrated, just heavy. I paused, putting the laundry basket down. "What's up?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I knew this moment was anything but ordinary. He hesitated before stepping inside the room. There was a long pause, and I could see he was struggling with something. Something he was trying to decide if he should say out loud. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I need to tell you something." The words were simple, but there was an unmistakable weight in his tone, a seriousness that caught me off guard. I was about to ask what was on his mind when he continued.
"I've been thinking about a lot of things," he started, looking away from me. "And I don't know how to say this, but I've never felt like you really fit into the family."
The room seemed to freeze. His words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. What he said wasn't angry, but it was deep, cutting in a way that felt unfamiliar. I had been prepared for many things: a frustration about school, a fight with a friend, maybe even a question about the family rules. But this was something else entirely. I didn't respond immediately. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he'd just said. I had been his stepmom for years now. We had been through a lot together. School projects, family trips, birthdays. But somehow, I never expected to hear that from him. And yet, there it was. The truth, raw and unfiltered. "I didn't want to say anything before," he added, his voice faltering slightly. "But lately, it's felt like you were just there, like you weren't really part of everything else. I don't know how to explain it, but I've never really felt like you're part of the family." Each word sliced deeper than the last, but I stayed quiet, letting him speak. This wasn't a moment for me to interrupt. This was his truth, his pain, and all I could do was listen. The silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating almost, but I didn't want to break it. I had to respect what he was saying. This wasn't about me feeling hurt. It was about him finally saying what had been unsaid for so long. After what felt like an eternity, I finally found my voice. "I never meant to make you feel like that," I said, trying to steady my emotions. "I care about you. I always have." But his expression didn't soften. If anything, he seemed more distant, like the conversation was just a small part of a much bigger picture. "I know," he said, shaking his head, "but sometimes it felt like I was the one holding it all together, like everything else was fine, but I was the one who was left out." In that moment, everything clicked. I realized it wasn't about me trying to be his mother. It wasn't about proving my place in the family. It was about understanding that our connection, our relationship, was still in the process of being built, and maybe I hadn't been paying close enough attention to the gaps he felt, the moments I hadn't even seen. This wasn't going to be a quick fix. This wasn't about one conversation, one moment of revelation. But it was a start, a step towards something deeper, something more honest. And though the conversation wasn't easy, though it was filled with discomfort and uncertainty, I knew it was something we both needed. I had no idea what to expect when he asked to talk, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. As I moved around the house, tidying up, he came in quietly. His steps were measured, deliberate. He wasn't his usual self. Normally he would have barged in, joking around, maybe even throwing a comment about something he saw on TV. But this time, he stopped at the door and just looked at me. There was an intensity in his eyes that I couldn't ignore.
I felt a pang of discomfort, a sense that something was about to change. I set aside what I was doing and looked up at him. "What's on your mind?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even, though I could feel my heart beating faster.
After a long pause, he sat down. His face was unreadable, but there was something different about him. "I need to know something," he began, his voice almost too quiet. "How do you really feel about me?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, I didn't know how to react. I had no preparation for that. I had no idea what he was looking for or why he'd ask something so personal. His words felt heavy, like they carried a weight far greater than I expected. It wasn't just a passing thought or a comment. It felt like he had been carrying that question with him for a long time. I stammered. The truth was, I didn't know how to answer. Was he frustrated? Did he feel overlooked? I could sense that whatever he was about to say, it had been building up inside him for a while. I paused, trying to gather my thoughts. "I care about you," I said finally. The words felt almost too simple, but they were true. However, I could tell by his expression that it wasn't the answer he was searching for. "Do you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because it doesn't always feel that way. Sometimes it feels like you're just here, doing your part, but not really here." His words cut deeper than I expected. I had been trying so hard to be the right kind of stepmom, to fit into a family dynamic that wasn't my own. But this was different. He wasn't angry. He wasn't accusing me of anything specific. He was simply stating the truth. His truth. And in that moment, I realized how much I had missed, how much I hadn't been paying attention to. I had tried to be there for him, help with his schoolwork, cheer him on at his soccer games, but all of that seemed irrelevant now. What he needed, what he was asking for, was something deeper. He needed to feel like he mattered, like he was more than just someone I was supposed to care for. "I never meant for you to feel like that," I said softly, trying to make sense of what he was telling me. I didn't realize. My voice faltered. I couldn't explain how, despite all my good intentions, I had missed this. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at me. "It's not just about what you do," he said, his voice catching slightly. "It's about how I feel, and sometimes I just don't feel like I'm really part of this family, like I'm just an outsider." Those words hit me like a wave. I hadn't known it had gotten that far. I had always thought that somehow I was doing enough, maybe not perfectly, but enough. But he had felt the distance, and that realization, sharp and raw, made my chest tighten. He wasn't asking for grand gestures. He wasn't asking for me to prove my love in some monumental way. He just wanted to know if I saw him, if I understood him. And in that moment, I realized that I hadn't truly understood, not in the way he needed.
I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I'm sorry you've felt that way," I said, my voice steady despite the rush of emotions. "I never meant for you to feel alone in this."
There was a long silence between us, and for the first time, it felt like we weren't just playing roles in each other's lives. We were connecting, really connecting. "I don't want you to just do your part," he said, almost in a whisper. "I want to know that you care, really care, that you're here for me." That request, simple as it seemed, left me speechless. It wasn't something I could answer right away. This wasn't about comforting him with words. It was about showing up in ways I hadn't before. "I'm here," I said. "I am here, and I'll do better, I promise." In that moment, I understood that the journey wasn't just about building a bond through time and actions. It was about being there emotionally, without the walls, without the distance. It was about showing up for him in a way that was meaningful, not because I had to, but because I truly wanted to. The moment his words settled in, I felt like the ground beneath me had shifted. I didn't know how to react. No amount of preparation could have prepared me for this kind of honesty. It wasn't anger in his voice, it wasn't frustration, but there was something heavier, more challenging, a kind of quiet sadness that lingered between us, and I couldn't ignore it. I sat there, struggling to put the right words together. I had always prided myself on being someone who could handle tough situations, but this was different. It wasn't a problem I could solve with a quick solution. It was a reflection of a deeper gap in our relationship, a gap I hadn't even realized existed. As I looked at him, the truth began to sink in. I had been so caught up in the everyday routines of life, work, home, everything that needed doing, that I had missed the signs. I thought we were doing fine. I thought the little things I did for him mattered, helping him with his homework, attending his games, keeping things in order around the house. But what he needed, what he was asking for, was far more than that. He wasn't looking for chores done or promises made. He was asking for emotional presence, something I hadn't fully given him. I had always been the good stepmom in my mind. I thought I had been patient, understanding, even supportive. But now I realized how much I had failed to really connect with him on a deeper level. There had been so many moments where I thought I was doing the right thing, yet I had missed what really mattered. It wasn't just about what I'd done. It was about what I hadn't done. I hadn't checked in on how he was feeling. I hadn't sat with him and asked the questions that could have opened this door long before now. It was the little things that had been overlooked, the moments where I could have stopped and listened, really listened, instead of just going through the motions. This wasn't a fault that could be fixed with a simple apology. No, the damage wasn't something I could erase with a few kind words. What had been left unsaid, the things we never discussed, had accumulated over time, and now it was all coming to light in this one conversation. I could feel the weight of the silence that stretched between us. There was so much I wanted to say, but nothing felt right. All I could do was sit there, processing his words, trying to figure out how we had gotten here. How had we reached a point where he felt invisible in the very family that was supposed to be his support system? And then it hit me. How often had I been the one to let small things slide? How many times had I brushed off his quiet moments, thinking he was just going through a phase? I had assumed that time and patience would be enough to bridge the gap, but I hadn't realized that he needed more than time. He needed understanding, acknowledgement, and, most of all, he needed to feel like he mattered. At that moment, the full weight of my responsibility as a stepmom became clear. It wasn't just about stepping in and trying to replace his biological mother. It was about being present in a way that truly counted. I had assumed the bond would naturally form, but what I failed to recognize was that it required intentionality, effort, and emotional availability on my part. The truth was, I had failed to recognize the tension brewing beneath the surface. It wasn't about a lack of care or effort. It was about a lack of connection, of truly seeing him for who he was, beyond the label of stepson. I had overlooked the quiet calls for help, the unspoken need for validation, the moments where he was silently reaching out for someone to truly see him. I didn't realize how much this meant to you, I finally managed to say, my voice quiet. I've been so focused on everything else that I didn't even see how much you were hurting. He looked at me, a hint of uncertainty still lingering in his eyes, but this time there was also something softer, something that suggested a willingness to let down the walls he had built. I just wanted to know if you cared about me, he said, almost quietly. I needed to know you saw me, really saw me, not just as the kid in the house, but as someone who matters. His words struck me deeply, and I knew, without a doubt, that this moment marked the beginning of something new for us. This wasn't going to be an easy fix, but it was the beginning of the kind of conversation I should have had with him a long time ago. A conversation that would allow us to rebuild the trust and connection that had been missing. The moment my stepson voiced his feelings, it hit me like a slap. As much as I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that we were making progress, the truth was staring me in the face. I hadn't been present in the way he needed me to be. I hadn't seen him, not really, not the way he deserved. The house, the chores, the day-to-day tasks, all of that had consumed me, but in that moment, I realized something more important was missing. This wasn't about sweeping the floor or making dinner. It was about taking care of what truly mattered, the emotional landscape of our family. It wasn't a wake-up call in the sense of some dramatic event or confrontation. It was quieter than that, more subtle. But as I sat there, hearing him speak, I understood how much we had drifted apart. I had been busy with everything except the one thing that really mattered, him. I had been looking at all the surface-level details while overlooking the deeper things, his quiet needs, his silent attempts to connect. I realized, that I'd failed to nurture the relationship in the way it needed to grow. I had assumed that if I did my part as a stepmom, kept the house in order, kept my distance just enough so he could have his space, that everything would fall into place. But I had missed something crucial. It wasn't enough to just be there. I needed to be emotionally there too. I had to stop brushing off the moments that seemed trivial or unimportant. I had to stop thinking that time would fix things on its own. That conversation was a turning point, not just in my relationship with him, but in how I saw myself as a stepmom. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being real. It was about showing up, even when it felt uncomfortable, and being open to the hard truths. The truth was, I wasn't as present as I thought. I had been distant in ways that I hadn't even realized, and it was time to face that head on. But this wasn't just about the mistakes I had made. It was also about what came next. I couldn't go back and undo the years of missed opportunities. What mattered now was what I chose to do moving forward. This conversation wasn't a finish line. It was the beginning of a new kind of relationship. And it wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready to try, to truly see him, to listen. In the days that followed, things felt different. There was a shift, though subtle. I found myself more aware of the small moments, the ones that used to slip by unnoticed. A simple look, a casual question, a small gesture. All of them became more meaningful, and for the first time, I realized how often I had let those moments pass by without truly acknowledging them. I started asking myself, what do I need to hear from him? What's he not saying out loud? I also realized how important it was to create space for him to speak openly. This conversation had cracked open a door I hadn't even known was there. And now that it was open, I wasn't going to let it close again. The day after our conversation, I made a small but significant change. Instead of staying wrapped up in my usual tasks, I sat down with him. We talked about school, his friends, the things that mattered to him, without the rush of trying to get things done. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it felt like a breakthrough. And that small change made me realize that it's not always the big moments that transform relationships. It's the quiet ones, the ones we almost overlook, that have the most impact. This wasn't about fixing everything all at once. It was about taking that first step toward truly connecting. It wasn't about me being the perfect stepmom. It was about being a real, consistent presence in his life, no matter how imperfect that might look. The weeks that followed our conversation weren't easy. In fact, they were a bit uncomfortable at times. But that was the price of progress, and I was willing to pay it. What stood out the most was how much we had been avoiding each other without even realizing it. There were moments when I felt like we were taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but it wasn't about perfection. It was about consistency, about trying, even when it was hard. I started reaching out more, checking in on him in ways I hadn't before. Small things like asking how his day went or just sitting with him for a few quiet moments became routine. And he started talking more too. At first it was small talk, but then we began to dig deeper. I'd listen to what he had to say without jumping in with advice or explanations, and I realized that in doing so, I was learning more about him than I ever had before. There were still times when we hit bumps. I wasn't a perfect stepmom, and he wasn't always the easiest teenager to communicate with, but we learned how to navigate the awkwardness. We learned to show up, to be present even when the conversation was tough. Sometimes it was just sitting in silence together, but that in itself was progress. The most noticeable change came when he finally admitted something he'd been holding on to. One evening, after weeks of small talks, he looked at me and said, "I think I get it now. I know you're trying. I see it." Those words didn't change everything overnight, but they marked a turning point for me. It was like the weight of all the unspoken things that had been hanging between us started to lift, just a little. And with each honest conversation, we became a little more connected. I won't pretend that the relationship was fixed in an instant. We still had our struggles, but the growth was undeniable. We started understanding each other in a way that hadn't been possible before. And through it all, I learned something incredibly important. The strength of a relationship doesn't come from avoiding hard conversations. It comes from the willingness to face them. And sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones that help us move forward. In the end, the biggest lesson was simple. Love isn't just about the good times or the easy moments. It's about the willingness to stay, to listen, and to be vulnerable enough to let the tough moments shape you. The bond I now have with my stepson isn't perfect. It's still a work in progress. But it's real, and it's stronger than it's ever been. So, if you are in a similar place, where the words are hard to say, or the silence feels heavy, just know that it's okay. Relationships take time, patience, and a whole lot of courage. And sometimes, the smallest shifts can lead to the biggest changes. If you've had a moment like this, where a conversation shifted everything for you, or if you're working through something tough in your family, hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that are real and full of growth. Thanks for being here.